Unit 2, Developmental Psychology. Presentation 5, Disruption of Attachment.
Psychologists such as John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth have emphasised the value of attachment. Research supports their belief that secure attachment is important for healthy social and emotional development. This suggests that any breakdown in attachment might have negative effects on development.
For example, let's take the case where an infant has formed an attachment to their biological mother in infancy. The child's mother might become ill, and the child has to spend a period of time separated from her, or parents are divorced and the child no longer lives with its mother. It might be that the child's mother dies, or perhaps just becomes severely depressed and can no longer provide emotional care. These are all examples of disruption.
The child has formed one special attachment with a person, and this has been interrupted. Disruption is not the same as physical separation. The concept of disruption means that for a period of time, the child's primary source of attachment is no longer emotionally available.
This can happen even when a mother is present. For example, she might be extremely withdrawn because she is depressed. Now let's look at research on the disruption of attachment. The key study in this area was conducted by husband and wife researchers James and Joyce Robertson. In the 1960s and early 1970s, the Robertsons filmed a number of children during periods of brief separation from their parents.
One of the children they filmed was a 17-month-old boy called John. John had to spend 9 days in a residential nursery while his mother was in hospital having a second child. Although John's physical needs were met, staff in the residential nursery had little time to look after John emotionally. Even though his father visited him, John became more and more withdrawn and depressed over the course of the 9 days.
The Robertsons also filmed 4 other children: Jane, Lucy, Thomas, and Kate. These children were all under the age of 3 and experienced separation while their mothers had to spend time in hospital. The difference between these children and John was that they were looked after by the Robertsons in the Robertsons' own home. The Robertsons tried to sustain a high level of substitute emotional care for these children, and to keep routines similar to those at the child's home. Father's visits were arranged regularly to maintain emotional links with home, and the children were also taken to visit their mothers in hospital.
The key point is that John experienced both physical and emotional separation and displayed a severe negative response. In contrast, the other 4 children only experienced physical separation. Disruption of attachment was prevented by offering substitute emotional care. It appears that separation from a primary attachment figure has the potential for harm, but the negative effects of disruption can be counteracted by offering substitute emotional care. Other research has focused on the effects of emotional disruption without physical separation. For example, Hart and colleagues studied the interactions between about 100 depressed mothers and their infants in the strange situation. The infants in Hart's study showed signs of insecure attachment, such as low levels of separation anxiety. They tended not to seek closeness to their mothers, but in contrast were friendly to the stranger and showed little signs of stranger anxiety. Such insecure attachment is likely to lead to negative outcomes, such as finding it difficult to make and maintain friendships.
So, altogether, this research shows that harm comes from emotional disruption rather than physical disruption on its own. The problem is that physical disruption often results in emotional disruption as well. However, the negative effects of such disruption can be avoided if a child is offered good substitute emotional care. Further research has addressed the question of whether these effects are long-term or only short-term.
One study looked at over 600 adopted children in Sweden who had experienced disruption of attachment during their early years. Bowman and Sigvardsson found that at the age of 11, 26% of these children were classified as problem children. They were reported as more anxious and less well-adjusted than their classmates.
This suggests a link between disruption of attachment and negative effects. However, in a follow-up study 10 years later, the adopted children were the same as normal children in terms of their social and emotional development.
This supports the view that there are no long-term effects as long as good substitute emotional care has been available.
In contrast, however, a classic study by Antonia Bifulco and colleagues found there were important long-term effects from the disruption of attachment. The researchers interviewed 249 women who had lost their mothers through separation or death before they had reached the age of 17. This group was twice as likely to suffer from depressive or anxiety disorders in adulthood as compared with national averages for such disorders. This suggests that early disruptions in attachment might make an individual psychologically more vulnerable and, if triggered by stressful events later in life, mental disorders might develop.
This is an example of the diathesis stress model. A diathesis is a vulnerability. In the case of Bifulco's research, the vulnerability is not genetic, but is created by the early experience of attachment disruption. The stress part of the diathesis stress model occurs later in life if difficult experiences are encountered, such as losing a job or a painful breakup of a relationship. Such stressors would trigger the diathesis.
So, what this means is that people can recover from attachment disruption with no apparent signs of harm. However, early experiences of attachment disruption create a vulnerability. This might lead to depression or some other mental disorder later in life if triggered by stressful experiences.
Evaluating research on the disruption of attachment. The Robertsons' research was a series of case studies. The problem with such research is that it involves a group of individuals in unique circumstances. As a result, we can't assume that all children would respond in the same positive way to the substitute emotional care offered by the Robertsons.
In addition, there is the issue of observer bias. The Robertsons might have been selective in what behaviour they chose to record, and might have been biased in their views of the children's behaviour. For example, their expectations might have led to them noticing only certain aspects of the children's behaviour.
Nevertheless, the Robertsons' conclusions about the importance of substitute emotional care have been supported by other research, such as an earlier study by Skodak and Skeels in 1949. In this study, children living in an orphanage were divided into two groups. One group remained in the orphanage, while the other group was transferred to a home for mentally retarded adults.
This might seem rather strange, but the philosophy behind it came from an earlier study. It was found that young orphanage children who were moved to another institution where they were living with mentally retarded adults did better intellectually than those who remained in the orphanage.
The outcome in the later Skodak and Skeels study was that the children placed with the mentally retarded adults showed significant improvements in their IQs. The retarded adults act as attachment figures and provided substitute emotional care, which enhanced the children's contentment, enabling them to do well intellectually.
Many of the studies on this topic of attachment disruption are natural experiments or case studies, which makes it difficult to demonstrate that disruption of attachment is actually the cause of any of the negative effects observed.
For ethical reasons, it's not possible to artificially create situations where children are separated from their mothers. Therefore, researchers have to rely on natural experiments and observations. Such research techniques lack control over important variables, such as the extent to which the child did receive emotional care and/or did form attachments. This means that we cannot demonstrate that disruption has been the cause of subsequent developmental difficulties.
A final critical point concerns individual differences in responses to attachment disruption. It is possible that there is an interaction between attachment type and the effects of attachment disruption. For example, it could be that children who are securely attached cope better with disruption than those who are insecurely attached.
For example, John Bowlby conducted some research on children with tuberculosis. These children had to live for long periods in a special isolation hospital and had little contact with their families, so we might assume that they experienced disruption of attachment. When these children were tested in adolescence, Bowlby found that some were quite normal in terms of social and emotional development, whereas others were emotionally maladjusted. Bowlby suggested that those who coped better were securely attached and thus more resilient to the disruption of attachment.
What can we conclude? The research seems to show a clear difference between the effects of physical separation and emotional disruption. When children experience physical separation from their primary attachment figure, this does not have negative effects as long as alternative emotional care is provided. However, such children might be more vulnerable to mental disorders in later life when having to cope with stressful situations.